Dr. John Pitts is a retired family doctor and medical educationalist, and he's going to talk about how an exploration of family history, this is specifically, you don't want me saying to his wife Yvonne and her family history, led to his writing an historical novel. So, okay, over to you, Dr. John.
Okay, well, thank you for coming. I'm going to take you back 2,000 years in stages through some major historical events in England and Wales, and I'm going to introduce you to some fascinating characters who were involved with them. We're going to go back for the main event to a rebellion in 286 by two characters called Carausius and Allectus, which meant that Britain was taken out of the Roman Empire for 10 years. Now, I'm not a historian. Through this work I've got a collection of what I call my historical pen friends. I've got a writer, academics, researchers, in particular someone called Darrell Walcott, who runs the Centre for Study of Ancient Wales in Jefferson, Texas, and his skill is putting together chronologically stable family trees from scraps of ancient manuscripts. So his work was very helpful. Now, as you've heard, I've spent my life in medicine. Medicine has a lot of what's called grey literature. It's stuff that doesn't make the mainstream journals. It's small studies, uncontrolled studies, case reports, theories, that sort of stuff. And often you have to dig for stuff, and the internet makes a very good spade. Medicine also, for testing a new drug, we have something called a randomized double-blind controlled trial, where the patients are matched for disease, they're randomized into groups, the drugs are made to look the same way, they're coded, neither the doctor nor the patient knows what they're getting, and you know whether drug A, new drug A, is better than old drug B or placebo. Very good. But if your study shows that new drug A is good, it's more likely to get into a mainstream journal than if it shows that it's no better or worse. And of course, it'd be quite useful to know that. Also in medicine, we had many hundreds of years of bleeding people who were sick or dying. Now, somebody at one point had to say, well, hang on a minute. So we have to consider issues of bias and mindless repetition of things. Now, right, well, what happened? In the lockdown period, I had previously tried to find my family history, and all I discovered going back to the 17th century, they were all peasants. They didn't own anything, no records, no nothing really. But I did learn that if you go back 3 billion years to Luca, last universal common ancestor, every single one of my ancestors, through at least 5 mass extinctions, lived long enough to pass on its genes. So I may have no history, but like you, I'm from a long line of winners. Now, things were rather different when I found some papers in my wife's material. What happened was, the first thing was finding a chart written in 1940 by Mary Lewis, a retired spinster headmistress, who used all sorts of records to put this chart that took the family back to the medieval period, which was usefully and valuably condensed into this little booklet. And I'm going to talk about the Don family of Kidwelly. Now, they had an emblem, a sheaf of snakes. They had a motto, I yield to the king and the law, which was slightly ironic, there's a couple of them. And they have a family crest, a wolf salient, argent, languid gules, no tittering at the back. That really looks like a startled bunny rabbit with a large tail, so what I'll do is give you this. This is the Stark family from Game of Thrones, of course. I'm sure they won't mind my borrowing it. So this family, I'm going to do a sort of bullet pointy talk through. And born in 1220, we have a character called Cadogan. Cadogan is an honorific title meaning battle in glory. And he served Edward, the Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince. But he's mostly in our story because when Edward II and his lover fled to Wales, he took sanctuary, first of all, in Caerphilly Castle, and he sent his treasure on to Neath and Swansea castles, whereupon most of it disappeared. Edward II was then captured in Neath, taken to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, and killed by having a red-hot poker put up his bottom. So that stopped his further interest in this. Edward III, his son, took the throne at the age of 14, and got pretty soon involved with the 100 Years' War with France, so he was out of it. Then the son significantly served Henry the Duke of Lancaster, who was in fact a first cousin once removed of Edward II and actually quite wanted to get rid of him. But he led 350 men to France in 1345. In 1346, the next year, we have this massive battle of Crécy, where the Welsh and the English archers slaughtered the cream of the French aristocracy who were prancing about in armour on horses. And then we come to Henry. Henry supported the king, but suddenly he decided that he would support Owen Glyndwr in his rebellion. And Owen Glyndwr wrote My Good Friend Henry Donne, and there's a book in this library describing Henry Donne as Owen Glyndwr's swashbuckling lieutenant. Having taken Carmarthen Castle, he besieged Kidwelly Castle in 1403. This is quite a family affair. He had 3 sons and his teenage grandson Griffith with him. 2 sons, Michael and Jenkin, were killed. Meredith fortunately survived to carry on the line. When the rebellion fell apart, he was locked up, first Kidwelly, then Gloucester, had his lands taken, and then suddenly was pardoned. He was fined £200, which he never paid. And then the teenage son Griffith became a supporter of Henry V. He was only pardoned in 1413, and he then fought as a young man-at-arms at Agincourt, a battle against the French, where the Welsh and the English archers slaughtered the cream of the French aristocracy on horseback, prancing about in armour. They never learn. He held many posts in France. At least one of his sons was conceived in France, and when he retired, it was back to Kidwelly as Lord of Penalt. His 4 sons, when young, had to flee to Uncle David in Powys because they slayed the mayor of Kidwelly. Uncle David was a marcher lord. These were placed by the king to secure the boundaries against mostly the Welsh. Then we have another son of Merith, who second in command to Richard, Duke of York, at Henry IV's court, and he fought in Ireland as a captain of cavalry. And then another Henry Dunn, son of Owen, supporting the Yorkists, got executed alongside Sir William Herbert, who was made Earl of Pembroke when Jasper Tudor had to leave the country. Now, our John had 2 sons, Griffith and Edward. Griffith was a favourite of Henry VIII's court. He was present at major events like the meeting of the Field of the Cloth of Gold with the French king and part of the reception party for Anne of Cleves. And so Edward was a jousting partner of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was very, very keen on jousting, and in 1524 he got a massive bash on the head from Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and was unconscious for 48 hours. But he didn't learn, and even in his 40s he was jousting, and he had that exercise where he was unhorsed and got the gouge on the leg, which for the rest of his life was a nasty suppurating wound. So I did think it would be rather funny if it had been delivered by this character. So in summary, we have this amazing family coming down, straddling all these events of history. Most had military careers. They became very rich trading in wine, which is interesting, because you may know in Newport they're reconstructing a 15th century wine importing ship. I've got 4 names of boats that this family owned: the James of Tenby, the George, the Margaret, and the Saint Marie. And they were described as a family on the edge of history. And indeed, there is almost a sort of Max Boycean element to this collective family. You know, I was there when things were happening. Now, carrying on our journey, just a few snippets. This is a petition from Sir Griffith Dunn to Henry V's Parliament for permission to buy land in England. You will see, although as he is Welsh, an ordinance of the King's progenitor prevents him from purchasing land. So I think we've got a Cymru phobia. We've got a new one. But it was granted, and he did buy land. This is the ruin of Penalt Manor. It's sitting in a farmer's field 2 miles west of Kidwelly. It's on the Ordnance Survey map as a ruined priory. This is because Griffin and his wife petitioned Pope Eugenius IV for permission to install an altar in the house. And the house has been sort of reconstructed as a theoretical picture by a Dr. Davis, and it does look quite a des res for a retired lord. A few snippets. Sir John had this triptych painted by Hans Memling in Bruges. It's said to be the earliest picture of a Welshman, and we have Sir John, his wife Elizabeth, a couple of daughters, Virgin Mary and Child, the obligatory angels, flanked by St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. So no small ego, this man. And this is another John Donne's house. He left Kidwelly, became a sheep farmer in Sherborne, Dorset, and this is 58 French Street in Old Southampton. And in 1461, Edward IV appointed him mayor of Southampton to sort out a few little problems. Nice bit of nepotism, perhaps. Now, in my journey now, going back, I want you to imagine you're in a time machine. We're gliding back, and as we go through the 10th century, we slow a bit, and we see Cecil ap Cynfyn, Lord of the Gower. Now, he's interesting because when he died, his son didn't get the land. It was taken by Hywel Dda, the first king of a unified Wales, with some sort of adjudication by Athelstan, first king of a unified England. Going back further, I was very surprised when a word kept cropping up, Brenin. Brenin, as you know, is Welsh for king. And not just one king, 14 consecutive kings and rulers of Dyfed flowed. I'm going to introduce you to some of them. This Cadogan had 3 sons, and Tudos was the youngest, so the throne didn't go to him. But if we come down through this lot, we get to a character called Vortapir. Writing contemporaneously, a monk called Gildas described him as seated on a throne of lies and steeped from head to toe in murder, and the bad son of a good king. We see the first signs of Romanization, really. His grave marker is in the museum at Carmarthen, and it describes him as Vortepirix. It's also got the Irish Ogham script, the 20-letter alphabet of carved horizontal lines. And the good king, his father, Ercol Lorhe, was known as Agricola, and his father, Tryphon Farfog, the bearded one, was known as Tribunos. And then we get to Adabrosk, king of Dyfed. Now, Adabrosk's grandfather was Irish. He was a prince of the Daisai tribe, who were a rather dispossessed bunch. Ireland was a very bloody and competitive place with lots of the rulers killing each other, and they were invited into West Wales to stabilise the place against more Irish incursions. You know the story of St. Patrick, who was kidnapped by Irish slavers, taken to Ireland for 6 years, escaped, came back, converted to Christianity, then went back from Wales to Ireland to convert them, leaving all his pet snakes at home. Anyway, I'm sure you're asking, how did this second-generation Irish immigrant come to be king of Dyfed? Well, I'm going to tell you. First of all, we're going to meet some of the players in the rebellion. We have 2 Roman emperors, Maximian and Maxentius. I want to talk briefly about panegyrics. These were talks delivered by a sort of poet laureate figure in front of the emperor, saying how wonderful he is. You'll have a great victory, you've scored a great victory, you're the best things in sliced bread, that sort of stuff. And a panegyric about Maxentius delivered about him to his father predicted great things. And Maxentius did indeed become a great emperor in Rome itself. He did lots of building. He built a great basilica of Constantine, and he also gave us a Catherine wheel firework when St. Catherine of Alexandria got a bit too pious, and he ordered her execution by being strapped to a wheel. And the story goes the wheel broke as she was being attached, fell to the ground, so she was dispatched with a sword. Now, after the rebellion was put down, Maximian came as a Taur. His son Maxentius, aged about 21, came over as well, and he managed to meet the daughter of King Eudaf Hen, known as Octavius in northwest Wales, and whether it was love, lust, or politics, conceived a child who he never ever saw again because he went back to Italy. But Antonius Donatus Gregorius, or Anwyn Dynod in the Old Welsh literature, he was placed in the Dyfed area after the rebellion because there was a vacuum and the local family was disgraced. And he and his son were very well accepted, so they carried on. Clydwyn's son, Maelgwyn, died, so the line, as Darrell Walcott put it, daughtered out. And our young Irish immigrant was there, handsome enough to take the place. Now, this is Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maxentius Augustus, and his father, Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximus Herculis Augustus. Marcus Aurelius is a name that quite a few Roman emperors took. They tried to absorb and reflect the cachet of a revered and great earlier emperor. It's a habit which has died out, really, which is because probably we would have had things like Margaret Hilda, Theresa May, or Margaret Hilda, the rest of it. Anyway, it's just as well it's died out. Now, in the Welsh corner, we have the 4 sons of Einod, who between them controlled the entire periphery of Wales. With permission of the Romans, they had to pay taxes, pay tribute, contribute soldiers when necessary, and generally behave themselves. And Caradoc in Dyfed had a son called Ceris, who became Romanized as Carausius, and Arthfael in Siluria, which is where we are now, had a son called Xander, which is Welsh for Alexander, who became Romanized as Allectus. Now, how did Einod get here? Well, into Wales, South Wales probably, around 60 BC came a character called Lear Lediarth. He was a Goidelic Celt, liar half-speech, hard to understand, and he was a Menapian. He had a son called Bran, who then had a son called Caradoc ap Bran, who is the minor contender for the role of the Caraticus who was taken to Rome. It stemmed with being beaten by the army of Ostorius Scapula in the foothills of Snowdon. His entire family were captured. He fled to Yorkshire and was dobbed in by Queen Cartimandua. So they all got carted off for a ritual execution, and Caraticus made an impassioned speech to Emperor Claudius in front of the Roman Senate, and he was forgiven. There's a story that Bran, who was very elderly at the time, got locked up with St. Paul, who was wandering around making a nuisance of himself and being kicked out of various Mediterranean countries. But that's a bit hard to prove. But anyway, that's how we got to this lot taking over Wales. Now, behind the story, the Roman Empire in the 3rd century was a mess. Invasion, inflation, insurrection, infighting. In the east, 2 Roman emperors got killed with their armies on the battlefield. Even worse, Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I. He was so humiliated, he had to crouch at the king's feet to be used as a footstool during royal audiences. And when he got bored with this, he had Valerian flogged to death. Then he realized he hadn't got anywhere to rest his feet, so he had the body skinned, stuffed with straw, and invented a rather awkward-looking poof. That was the size of the Roman Empire in the crisis. It could take 30 or 40 days for a messenger to get from one end to the other going flat out. So it was really unwieldy. And into this mess came a man called Diocletian. He was a Dalmatian, not a spotty dog. He was from Croatia, and his palace in Split is still there today. And he was a strategist. He realized it was a mess. He tried things like price control, but in the end it was just too much. So he took his old military comrade Maximian, who was a tactician. He was a thug who won battles and was rather nasty to any prisoners if they were unlucky enough to be taken alive. And he gave Maximian the west half of the empire to control, and he sorted out the Persian side. England and Wales were interesting. The degree to which, after 200 years of occupation, the various tribes accepted Roman rule was very varied. There were some who were sort of sullen acceptance, and there were others who took Romanization on as quite enthusiastically. And Dyfed in West Wales is particularly interesting. Carmarthen in the year 70 was the usual collection of round houses, hill, fort, great hall. By 120, it was developing a grid system, stone buildings. It was adopted as a Roman civitas, or administrative centre, and it then developed an amphitheatre as the local multiplex entertainment system as well. And some of the locals would wear togas and speak Latin, so very different. Now, what do we know? A man called Carausius gained a military reputation fighting for Maximian in Gaul. He was put in charge of the Roman navy, charged with getting rid of pirates who were coming down from the Saxon regions and raiding the coastal areas of Gaul and England and really undermining Rome's authority. He was very successful. And then somebody reported to Maximian that not a lot of the loot was getting back to the Roman treasury because Rome wanted its cut, and also that he only attacked ships that had actually raided rather than on the way. Maximian orders Carausius' arrest and execution. Carausius rebels, declares himself Emperor of Britain, with massive support. 3 legions of troops in Britain, the navy, and then a legion in Gaul, in the northern French coast, and the great harbour and fort of Boulogne all rose in support. Carausius had complete control of the English Channel. Maximian creates an invasion fleet. The panegyric of 289, when this happened 3 years after Carausius had declared himself emperor, predicted a great victory. You will restore this nation to the Roman Empire. It was a complete disaster. Nobody knows why. Many soldiers were killed. Could have been a storm, could have been naval action. We don't know really. Carausius then did the sort of things that emperors did. He did some building, he made some coins, he produced one little coin that had got the silhouette of Maximian, Diocletian himself, calling them brothers, which I can't imagine went down terribly well. And then Maximian has a deputy, a man called Constantius, who is another one of these Balkan bunch people, who was a good military, effective soldier. He took an army up through Gaul and basically besieged Boulogne, which was a very clever way of building a jetty or mole most of the way across the river, so the fortress couldn't be relieved or stored by sea. So Boulogne fell. Constantius said to the ordinary Roman soldiers, "You've been terribly misled. Welcome back to the real Roman army. Come in, boys." Thereby saving a lot of lives, his own troops and the ones he'd now acquired, and boosting his forces. In 293, Allectus, who is known as his Minister of Finance, and from the argument from there was his cousin, kills Carausius. He then declares himself emperor in turn, and running into a few problems, but after this, what happened was that a proper invasion fleet was assembled, or rather 2 invasion fleets. Constantius has a deputy called Julius Sclepiodotus, who is his praetorian prefect, and in 296 there are 2 fleets ready to go. Constantius is aimed at getting round Kent, taking London. Sclepiodotus is to find a bridgehead on the south coast of England. There are very strong easterly winds. These boats have to be rowed, remember, and they go downwind with a sail, but anyway, Constantius was delayed in getting to London. Sclepiodotus' fleet got blown down the channel. As the storm abated, a sea mist descended, and he landed unopposed. He did the symbolic thing of burning his ships, which seems a bit vandalistic, really. Assembles his army and marches up to London. And Allectus leads his army, which is a bit more ragtag and dependent on a lot of Frankish mercenaries. Out from London, the Frankish mercenaries suddenly start to worry a bit, and a lot of them peel off and go back and start looting London. There's a brief skirmish. Allectus is killed, his body left at the roadside, and then Asclepiodotus and Constantius meet in London. They kill all the looting Franks, they cut their heads off, chuck them in a tributary of the Thames called the Walbrook, where they've been turning up hundreds of years later. Now, blank areas. Where did Carausius and Allectus actually come from? In my book, I've followed the Welsh line. I've given you the rationale and the family background to that. In a book, Carausius is actually quite easy. He's the archetypal warrior hero. He leads from the front. He's brave. Men respect him. They follow him to danger. Virtually nothing is known of Allectus. He's called Minister of Finance. He in most of the Roman reports, and the Romans weren't terribly keen on this getting around because they were a bit ashamed of the episode, but he was referred to as a pirate or a rebel, sort of generic terms. So the Allectus in my book is basically my creation. And what I've done is take the habit that the first governor of Britain, Julius Agricola, established, which was to take a son of the ruling tribal families, partly as a hostage, partly to Romanize them. And if they were fit and strong, they'd go into the army. If they weren't, they'd go into something else. And that is why Carausius ends up fighting in Gaul. And Allectus gets placed with a family in London who are basically the financial brains of the empire. And so this young man learns a lot about business and learns how empires run. If you Google Carausius, you will find he was a Menapian, almost without exception, and old textbooks. And the question then is how to reconcile this with the claim that he's Welsh. Well, the answer is 300 years. Let's say, who were the Menapians? Well, they were a Celtic tribe, first appearing in history about 600 BC. They had trading colonies all around. They founded Wexford in Eastern Ireland about 200 BC, and a colony in St. David's opposite in the St. George's Channel shortly after. And around 55 BC, they had a triple whammy problem. They had Saxons attacking them from the north. They had massive flooding in their low-lying lands around the Scheldt estuary in Belgium and Holland. And then Julius Caesar and his organized army arrived from the south. So many of them were killed and many fled, diaspora to their colonies. In his Gallic Wars memoirs, Julius Caesar rates them as his toughest enemy, really. And later on, when they were brought into the Roman Empire, they fought for the Romans in various battles. This map was drawn by a Greek geographer called Claudius Ptolemy about 140 AD. And this is the only place in the world that has a place called Menapia. If you make it slightly more modern, with the different tribes in Ireland, again, you have Menapia appearing there. If we look into the literature, Aurelius Victor, writing in Northern Africa, was the first person and the only person to say that Carausius was Menapian. Eutropius described the rebellion but didn't have anything to say about where he came from. Orosius copied Eutropius, Bede in England copied Eutropius. And just a few of these examples. John of Fordun was writing on behalf of Robert the Bruce of Scotland, who was trying to establish legitimacy as ruler of Scotland, and because Carausius had forged a treaty with the Picts to stabilize his northern border, he wanted that connection. Ginebrier wanted an Irish origin. He was working on behalf of Sir John Carteret, the Viceroy of Ireland, who wanted to trace his background back to the Hibernian Carausius. Zabarella was writing, most bizarrely, on behalf of the Doge of Venice, who wanted to establish his roots from a whole line of little Carausian antecedents. And then Captain George Berkeley of the Royal Navy used the argument of Carausius in his navy to explain why Britain needed a strong fleet to protect its borders. And in his Lives of the British Admirals, an author called Cunningham included Carausius as his first British admiral. There we've got the maps. So why was a soldier given the command of the Roman fleet? It doesn't have any logic, does it? Unless you come from a seafaring family with great skill, which his background was. Barry has the second highest tides in Europe. You'd have to deal with conditions here, which maybe some of the Roman skippers couldn't. Was the order to execute Carausius justified? If your boat rows at 4 knots and you're trying to catch another boat at 4 knots, it's obviously easier to catch one which is laden with a tired crew than one which is fresh, but we don't really know that. Why was the rising so popular? Well, we know that he had the army and the navy because he'd got a reputation, he'd earned it. What about the ordinary folk? You know, living in round houses with thatched roofs, they would see these Romans coming in, building villas with tiled roofs and mosaic floors and underfloor heating and internal bathrooms, things like that. Completely different. You know, you're bathing in a stream and you're looking at somebody with considerably better facilities. And of course, for the ordinary people, they had to take Roman laws. They had to pay taxes. Their menfolk could be taken away to fight, never to be seen again. And maybe they were regarded a bit like the American GIs in the Second World War. Over here, overpaid, oversexed. Quite a few years ago now, I read an article about why people hate America. I don't mean individuals, and I don't mean countries that are religiously or ideologically hostile. But if you take countries like France and Germany, in 1966, de Gaulle withdrew France from the power structures of NATO, and he said to Lyndon Johnson, "I want all American troops off French soil." And Lyndon Johnson famously said, "And are you including the thousands of dead ones who died for your freedom?" And then, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, that Macron said NATO was brain dead. And then we have examples of Germany with lukewarm about Ukraine, not allowing overflights, and getting, despite warning, very tied up with Russian oil and gas. Now, the Romans built 10,000 miles of roads in Britain. 10,000 miles. When you drive from Iscus Ilurum, Caerleon, over Cardiff to Bovium, Cowbridge, and on to Needham, Neath, you're not really on the A48, you're on the Via Julia Maritima. And the example of these roads slicing through the tribal lands, and what a symptom of power, because the answer is why people hate America is actually, it's because America can. It's got power, it's got resources. And roads were an obvious in-your-face demonstration of power. Perhaps there's just a feeling in the land. Now, this episode has been described as Britain's first Brexit, 286. In 1534, we had a Brexit under Henry VIII, powered by lust but stymied by the empire of the Roman Catholic Church. In 2016, we had a Brexit under a democracy. And this time we had the internet, newspapers, radio, and we knew, didn't we, the plans from the beginning for the European superstate. We knew the plans for the European army, the tensions of the single currency, north-south financial tensions, east-west cultural tensions, the lack of democracy, lack of accountability, the corruption, the punishment beatings given to Greece, forced to take bailouts and austerities of the German banks to get their interest. Perhaps there was a feeling in the land. Why did Allectus kill Carausius? Well, we don't really know. It could have been jealousy. It could have been he saw the writing on the wall. With the loss of Boulogne, the loss of control of the Channel, he was a financier. Now, we know governments don't have money, do they? They can borrow it to a point. They can print it or mint it, cause inflation. They can tax more, cause resentment. or they can cut back on spending. Now, the cost of keeping standing garrisons in all what were called the Saxon shore forts across the south of England must have been immense. And there probably were financial reasons as well. But perhaps he was led to believe that there was some sort of deal on offer. We don't know really. So that is the story of the rebellion and some of the bits I've had to deal with in the book. There is no mention of Carausius anywhere on the continent in any remaining material. There are two in Britain. This is a milestone from Carlisle. It's a lovely example of early recycling because when the rebellion was put down, the stone was flipped over and Constantine carved in the top. And we have this wonderful grave marker in the pretty little church in Penmachno. I've touched this. It says, "Here lies Carausius under this pile of stones." Now it's often discounted because it's got a Christian symbol and is said to be a bit later. Grey literature suggests that Allectus killed Carausius in Eboracum, York. And if you wanted to take his body back to Wales, you would take the Roman road across to Diva, Chester, which goes then under Lake Barla and north of Penmachno to meet Sarn Helen, the 160 miles superhighway between Carnarvon and Carmarthen and Neath. And it's conceivable to think that if his body was getting a bit smelly or a cart wheel broke, they were stuck in Snowdonia, what can they do but create a pile of stones to protect the body? Maybe one of his descendants went back to honour his memory. Afterthoughts. Now, we know in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, the royal families of Europe are very closely linked through marriage and relationships and all leading up to the three cousins and the First World War. And these families were actually very similar. I've put the chart that I've been showing you in part together, but you can see how this family are really holding the reins of power for an awfully long time, from the original Menapian settler down to the Romano-Celtic warrior we know as Arthur. One interesting little thing I've only discovered in the last month or so is that one of the other sons of Einard, Geraint, who was a ruler in northeast Wales, had a son called Cunnan who had a little bit of land called Meriadoc. And around 300, Maximian asked Cunnan Meriadoc to take some troops to Brittany, to sort out a little problem for him that he wasn't able to deal with at the time. So off goes Cunnan Meriadoc with 2,000 warriors, and they go to Brittany, they put down the rebellion, and Maximian gives them the land. A lot of the men stay on. The weather's nicer, and they call it Lydor in the line of their old homelands. And the southwestern part of Brittany becomes known as Cornouailles. It's known to the Romans as Armorica for seaside. Now, if you fast forward 5 generations from Cunnan Meriadoc and the ruling line of Brittany that is founded, we get to King Beudic II. Now, he's being besieged. He has to flee. Where does he go? Well, he goes back to West Wales. He goes to the court of Ercole Lawhere, the good king, near Penally, near Tenby and Liz Castell. Now, Ercole is very Christian. He's funded the original church in Llandaff and the original church in St. David's. And also at his court is St. Tylo, who becomes the first bishop of Llandaff. When Beudic gets to West Wales, he marries Anawed, who is the sister of St. Tylo and the daughter of St. Iseult, and they have 5 children. Howell goes back with Beudic when he successfully reclaims his throne and becomes a ruler of Brittany. Then we have St. Eudogui or Eudocius, who seem to be the same person and equally difficult to say. St. Typhi, who became a martyr, who was apparently, according to one source, killed with a javelin while trying to sort out some squabbling shepherds. and St. Ismail, who became bishop of the Roman Menevia St. David's diocese, and the wonderfully named St. Gwen the Three-Breasted. Now, my medical knowledge suggests that she actually had a third nipple with enough breast tissue to enlarge and lactate when she was pregnant, which I suppose might have been useful. It's not uncommon to have a third nipple. If you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you'd be burnt to death as a witch, but apart from that. So again, there's a remarkable control in this family of the religious side of it as well. Finally, I'm just going to show you, this is on the little thing in the Church of St. Ismail in Pembrokeshire, and they make the major mistake of saying that Budic was a Cornish prince because they confused Cornwall with Cornway. Finally, on the 28th of October in the year 312, the army of Maxentius, son of Maximian, and Constantine, son of Constantius, meet outside Rome at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. It's a fight for Rome itself. Constantine wins. He claims to have seen a cross in the sky, and he adopts Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's Peter Paul Rubens' portrayal of the battle. Just think, if the battle had gone the other way and Maxentius had beaten Constantine, Christianity might not have taken root in Europe, and we'd be worshipping Bacchus and drinking lots of beer and wine. That's my website at the top, where everything I have said is available to download free, apart from the book, which you can buy. This is the website of Darrell Walcott in Texas, where he's built a castle to house his library. And if you happen to bear an ancient name Wales, you might be amazed at what you can uncover there. Thank you very much.